Everyone's seen a tank in winter. The white paint, the snow-covered hulls, the silhouettes barely visible against a frozen landscape. It looks almost cinematic, almost planned. But here's the thing. That white wasn't just paint. It was desperation. It was lessons written in blood. It was the difference between a crew coming home and a crew that didn't. And the story of how Soviet tankers figured that out, why they painted their turrets, why they didn't always paint the whole tank, and why the method they chose was as chaotic and improvised as the war itself, is one of the most overlooked and genuinely fascinating stories to come out of the Second World War. If you want to understand what actually happened inside a Soviet armored unit in the middle of winter on the Eastern Front, stay right here, because we're going to go deep, not just the paint. The tactics, the decisions, the mistakes, the cold, the chaos, and the ingenuity that came out of some of the most brutal conditions any soldier has ever faced. And if this is the kind of history that grabs you, consider subscribing right now. We go this deep every single time. Let's start with something that seems obvious but wasn't obvious at all in 1941. The idea that a tank needs to be camouflaged in winter. When Germany launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, the Soviet Union was caught almost completely off guard. The scale of the surprise, the speed of the advance, the sheer number of men and machines thrown into the attack, it overwhelmed Soviet defenses in ways that are still staggering to consider. Entire armies were encircled. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were captured in the first weeks alone. The Soviet tank force, which was numerically enormous and included some genuinely capable machines like the T-34, was destroyed in massive numbers before it could even properly engage. In those early months, camouflage for Soviet armor was the last thing anyone was thinking about. Survival was the issue. Reorganization was the issue. Just getting men and machines to the front in one piece was the issue. But then winter came, and it came fast, and it came hard. The winter of 1941 into 1942 was one of the coldest in decades. Temperatures in some areas dropped to minus 40 degrees Celsius. Rivers and lakes froze solid, the ground turned to iron, and the entire landscape became a blinding, featureless expanse of white. And suddenly every single piece of military equipment that was painted in standard Soviet dark green, or German field gray for that matter, stood out against the snow like a signpost. You could see a tank from a kilometer away. You could spot a column of vehicles from an aircraft at altitude without even trying. The color contrast was so extreme that it essentially made camouflage patterns irrelevant. A tank that might be nearly invisible in a summer forest was now as visible as a black rock on a white tablecloth. The Soviet military had actually thought about this problem before the war. There were doctrinal guidelines about winter camouflage. There were discussions in military planning circles. But the chaos of 1941 meant that by the time the first serious winter arrived, most of those guidelines had either been lost in the collapse of entire command structures, never properly distributed, or simply impossible to implement because the factories, supplies, and organization needed to carry them out were shattered or overwhelmed. So what did the crews do? They improvised. And the improvisation that became the defining image of Soviet armor in winter, the whitewashed turret against a darker or partially white hull, was born not from a policy decision made in Moscow, but from the ground up. From individual crews, individual unit commanders, and a desperate practical logic that said simply, if we don't do something about this, we are going to die. The first approach was the most obvious one: white paint. Just paint the tank white. Cover as much of the surface as possible. Make it blend in. Simple, effective, logical. Except it wasn't simple. Not in 1941, not in 1942, and in many cases, not even later in the war. And the reason comes down to something very mundane, but critically important: supply. The Soviet logistical system, already under catastrophic stress from the German invasion, did not have vast reserves of white paint sitting ready to be distributed to armored units. Paint sounds like a trivial thing. In the context of a war where ammunition, fuel, spare parts, food, winter clothing, and basic medical supplies were all in critical shortage simultaneously, the idea of prioritizing the delivery of paint to tank units was genuinely difficult to justify in the supply chain. Other things came first. Shells came first. Diesel came first. Bread came first. So units that needed to paint their vehicles white had to find other ways. And the most common solution, the one that explains why the white often looks so uneven, so patchy, so different from unit to unit and even tank to tank within the same unit, is that they used whatever white material they could get their hands on. Lime whitewash. This was the big one. Calcium hydroxide mixed with water, the same material used to whitewash the walls of buildings across Eastern Europe and Russia for centuries, turned out to be a surprisingly functional short-term solution for tank camouflage. It was cheap. It was available. You could find it in virtually any village or town, and there were plenty of those along the Eastern Front, many of them already occupied or passing through Soviet control. A tank crew could pull into a village, find a supply of lime powder, mix it with water, and apply it to their vehicle using brushes, rags, or in some cases, their bare hands. The result was not elegant, it was not even. It did not cover beautifully. It ran and streaked and left patches of green or red primer visible underneath. In cold temperatures, the mixture could freeze before it properly adhered to the metal, leaving a surface that flaked and crumbled at the slightest touch. When temperatures rose even slightly above freezing, or when the tank moved through wet snow or rain, the whitewash could dissolve and run, revealing the original color underneath in uneven patterns. But here is the crucial insight that the crews learned quickly. Imperfect camouflage is still camouflage. A tank that is 80% white and 20% dark green is still dramatically harder to spot in a snow-covered landscape than a tank that is 100% dark green. The partial coverage, the streaks, the uneven patches, they actually broke up the outline of the vehicle in ways that pure flat white sometimes could not. From a distance, the tank did not look like a tank. It looked like a disturbed patch of snow, like a piece of ground that had been partially cleared, like almost anything other than a 30-ton armored vehicle. And this is where we get to the turret question specifically. Because one of the most commonly noted features of Soviet winter camouflage, the thing that actually prompted the question this entire video is built around, is that very often the turret was painted white while the hull, or parts of it, were not. Or the turret was more thoroughly covered than the rest of the vehicle. Or the whitewash was applied unevenly in ways that seemed to prioritize the upper surfaces and the turret over the lower hull. Why? The answer is not one single reason. It is a combination of several factors that all pointed toward the same practical outcome. First and most fundamentally, the turret is the most visible part of a tank, not just to aircraft looking down, but to enemy infantry, anti-tank gun crews, and other tankers looking across a flat, snow-covered landscape. The hull of a tank, especially in snow, has a natural tendency to be partially obscured. Snow collects along the lower hull. The tank sits lower than you might expect. The hull shape is broken up by the terrain it sits in. Ditches, ridges, destroyed buildings, frozen hedgerows, all of these create natural cover for the lower body of the vehicle. The turret, by contrast, protrudes. It sticks up. It is round and it is distinctive. To anyone who has ever tried to spot a tank in winter conditions, the turret is almost always the first thing you see. That distinctive rounded or angular shape rising above whatever the hull is hiding behind is the visual signature of a tank. Kill the visual signature, and you dramatically increase survivability. So if you only have a limited amount of whitewash, if you only have a few minutes before you have to move, if you can only reach certain parts of the vehicle without specialized equipment, you paint the turret. Second, the turret was often easier to reach. Soviet tanks like the T-34 and later the T-34/85, the KV series, and the IS series were large vehicles. Properly painting the entire lower hull required either lifting the vehicle, lying in the snow underneath it, or applying the material from an awkward angle with a long brush or mop. The turret, however, could usually be reached by a crew member standing on the engine deck or climbing onto the tank itself. In winter conditions, when time was short and conditions were brutal, the practical reality was that you painted what you could reach efficiently, and you could reach the turret. Third, there is a tactical dimension that goes beyond simple camouflage. The turret is where the gun is. The turret is where the crew operates from. In a hull-down position, which was a core Soviet tank tactic, the hull is hidden behind a ridge, a berm, a rise in ground, or the wreckage of a building, and only the turret is exposed. If you are fighting from a hull-down position, a very white turret against a very white snowfield is your primary camouflage. The hull almost does not matter. It is already hidden. So painting the turret thoroughly was not just aesthetic choice or random prioritization. It was tactically rational. The hull-down position deserves more attention here because it is central to understanding Soviet armored tactics in the winter fighting, and it explains why so many of the photographs from this period show exactly that same configuration of white turret, partially visible hull. Soviet doctrine, especially as it evolved through the brutal learning process of 1941 and 1942, increasingly emphasized the use of terrain. This was partly born of necessity. In the early war, the Soviets had lost so many tanks in frontal engagements, in open ground attacks against prepared German defensive positions, that the lessons about how not to use armor were written in catastrophic losses. By 1942, and certainly by 1943, Soviet tank doctrine was placing much greater emphasis on using ground intelligently, on coordinating infantry support with armored attacks, and on defensive positioning that maximized the advantage of the tank's gun while minimizing exposure of the vehicle itself. Hull down became a standard technique. The tank would move into a position where the hull was concealed below the crest of whatever terrain feature was available, and the commander would use the gun to engage targets while presenting the smallest possible cross-section to return fire. In winter terrain, this technique was often easier to execute than in summer, because the frozen ground could support a tank on slopes and embankments that would be impassable in mud, and because the snow itself could be used to build up revetments and firing positions relatively quickly. A tank in a proper hull-down winter position, turret whitewashed, hull buried in snow or concealed behind a frozen berm, was genuinely difficult to spot even at relatively short ranges. German anti-tank gun crews reported enormous difficulty engaging Soviet tanks in winter conditions, specifically because of this combination of white camouflage and terrain utilization. An 88mm gun, one of the most lethal anti-tank weapons of the war, was essentially useless if the crew could not identify and accurately range the target. And this brings us to the other side of the coin, because the Germans were dealing with exactly the same problem in reverse, and their approach to it was instructively different, and in many ways less effective, and understanding why helps explain what made the Soviet approach work. The German army in 1941 was not prepared for the Russian winter. This is not a controversial statement. It is historical fact. The planning for Barbarossa had assumed a campaign that would be concluded before the serious cold set in. Hitler and the German High Command genuinely believed the Soviet Union would collapse in weeks, and that the winter would not be a significant factor. When it turned out that they were catastrophically wrong, the German army found itself in conditions it was not equipped, clothed, or tactically prepared for. German armor in late 1941 was painted in the standard Wehrmacht field gray scheme, which had some winter utility, but was nowhere near as effective as white camouflage. The Germans attempted to apply whitewash to their vehicles, but their logistical situation along the extended Eastern Front supply lines was also under enormous strain, and critically, German tank crews initially showed less willingness or ingenuity in improvising solutions at the unit level. The Wehrmacht had a culture of operating from doctrine, from issued orders, from centralized supply. When the system could not deliver, the adaptation was slower. There is a famous and rather ironic contrast that historians of the Eastern Front often point to. In the winter of 1941 to 1942, German tankers were in many cases better fed and better equipped with quality vehicles than their Soviet counterparts. But Soviet crews were often more creatively adaptive, more willing to solve problems at the individual and small unit level, more capable of operating with improvised solutions in absolutely brutal conditions. Part of this was simply because they had no choice, but part of it was a cultural dimension of the Red Army's experience of fighting in winter. Something that Russian military history going back centuries had ingrained, even if the institutional knowledge had been disrupted by the purges of the late 1930s. The Soviet winter camouflage story is in many ways a story about that adaptability. The whitewash, the lime, the chalk, even the occasional use of white bedsheets draped over turret hatches, these were not elegant solutions. They were not the product of a well-functioning supply chain delivering properly tested military-grade white paint in adequate quantities to armored units. They were the product of people in impossible conditions deciding that imperfect action was better than no action. Now, let us talk about what the whitewash actually looked like up close. Because the photographs from this period, and there are thousands of them in Soviet archives and in collections assembled after the war, tell a story that is remarkably consistent in its inconsistency. No two tanks in the same unit look quite the same. Some are very thoroughly whitewashed, almost completely covered, with only exhaust stains and track marks revealing the original dark color. Others have large patches of green visible, especially around the hull sides and rear. Some have the whitewash applied in broad, sweeping strokes suggesting a brush or mop was used. Others have a more mottled, sprayed appearance that might suggest some form of applied wash rather than brushwork. Many show the characteristic streaking of lime whitewash that has been applied in cold conditions and has run before it dried. The turrets, as noted, are typically the most consistently covered. In many photographs of T-34 tanks from the 1941 to 1943 period particularly, the turret is thoroughly white, while the hull presents a more mixed picture. Later in the war, as supply chains improved and as factory-applied winter camouflage became more common, the coverage tends to become more complete and more consistent. But the improvised, crew-applied, uneven whitewash of the early war is distinctive and instantly recognizable. There is also an interesting evolution in the materials used. Early improvised whitewash was almost entirely lime-based, drawn from available local supplies. As the war continued and as the Soviet defense industry organized itself, some units began to receive actual military-issue white paint. This was typically an oil-based or water-soluble military paint rather than lime whitewash, and it adhered better, lasted longer, and covered more evenly. But it was also harder to remove. And this brings us to an important tactical consideration that affected how Soviet crews thought about winter camouflage throughout the entire war. The Russian winter is not static. The temperatures fluctuate, thaws occur, snow melts, and a tank that is brilliantly camouflaged in December can be starkly visible against partially melted ground in March. The ideal winter camouflage was one that could be applied quickly when snow was present and just as quickly removed or allowed to wear off when conditions changed. Lime whitewash was actually ideal in this respect. Its tendency to flake, run, and dissolve that seemed like a flaw was actually a feature in the context of rapidly changing winter conditions. A crew could apply a fresh coat when heavy snow fell, and within days or weeks of a thaw, much of it would have washed away naturally, revealing the underlying dark color scheme that was appropriate for spring mud season, a period of warfare in Russia known as Rasputitsa, which roughly translates to the season of bad roads, when the entire landscape turned to thick, sucking mud, and movement of any kind became a nightmare. Soviet crews became skilled at managing this cycle. Apply whitewash in late autumn as the first snows arrived, maintain it through winter by reapplying where it wore off, allow it to deteriorate or actively remove it as spring approached. Then return to the base green scheme, and sometimes apply various mud season camouflage using local materials for the summer and autumn fighting. The tank's crew relationship to their vehicle is also worth examining more closely here, because it tells us something important about why the camouflage practices varied so much, and why crew initiative played such a central role. A Soviet tank crew in the Second World War typically consisted of 4 or 5 men, depending on the vehicle: the commander, the gunner, the loader, the driver, and in some configurations a radio operator or hull machine gunner. These men lived with their vehicle in a way that is difficult to convey to anyone who has not experienced it. They maintained it, they repaired it, they slept next to it, or in some cases inside it, they cooked their meals against its warm engine decks, they understood its mechanical temperament in ways that no technical manual could fully capture. Their survival was bound up with the tank's performance in every dimension: mechanical, tactical, and visual. When a crew decided to whitewash their tank, it was not a bureaucratic compliance exercise. It was a survival decision made by men who understood that being spotted first in a winter engagement almost always meant being killed first. The unit commander might order it, but the execution was the crew's responsibility. And in the chaos of the Eastern Front, where units were constantly moving, constantly in combat or preparing for combat, where time for maintenance and preparation was brutally compressed, the quality and thoroughness of the camouflage depended entirely on the crew's judgment, energy, and available resources. This created enormous variation. A crew who had just come out of heavy combat and were desperately trying to rearm, refuel, and eat before the next engagement might apply a hasty coat of whitewash to the most visible surfaces and nothing else. A crew in a defensive position with a few hours of preparation time might do a genuinely thorough job that would be nearly invisible from 200 meters. The photographs show both extremes, and everything in between. The Soviet tank corps and mechanized armies that evolved through the mid-war period, particularly after the reorganization following the disaster of 1942 at places like Kharkov and the catastrophic losses of the first winter, developed better systems for collective maintenance and preparation. Unit-level supply of whitewash material became more organized. There are documented cases of entire tank brigades applying fresh winter camouflage simultaneously before a major operation, with materials brought up specifically for this purpose. This reflects the professionalization of Soviet armored forces as the war continued, the transition from an improvised, desperate defense to a coordinated, increasingly sophisticated military force. The Battle of Stalingrad deserves its own discussion in this context, because it represents one of the most extreme examples of winter combat in the entire war, and the camouflage practices of Soviet armor during that period were shaped by conditions that were literally unprecedented. Stalingrad in the winter of 1942 to 1943 was not primarily a tank battle. The urban fighting that consumed the city was largely an infantry and artillery struggle, with tanks used in close support roles rather than open maneuver warfare. But the encirclement of the German Sixth Army, Operation Uranus, which was launched on November 19, 1942, was very much a tank operation, and it was conducted in winter conditions that were already severe and getting worse. The Soviet armored units that broke through the Romanian flanks of the Stalingrad perimeter, driving in from north and south to close the encirclement, were moving across open steppe in snow and bitter cold. The camouflage practice of these units was particularly important because the steppe terrain offered almost no natural cover. There were no forests, no hills of significant height, no urban features. It was flat, white, open ground for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. Against this background, a dark green tank was visible from an enormous distance. Soviet armored columns conducting the encirclement operation were documented with extensive whitewash coverage. Many were photographed moving across the steppe with turrets and hulls broadly whitened, and the photographs from this period show the kind of comprehensive, carefully applied whitewash that suggests units had time and material to do the job thoroughly before the operation launched. This was not improvised desperation. This was planned operational preparation. The contrast with the German forces being encircled is stark in the historical photographs. German armor inside the Stalingrad pocket, increasingly unable to be resupplied, unable to maintain vehicles properly, began to show deteriorating camouflage, and in many cases vehicles that had lost most of their white covering, or never had adequate coverage in the first place. From a purely visual standpoint, looking at photographs from the Stalingrad encirclement, the Soviet armored force looks more professionally prepared for winter combat than the German force it was surrounding. Now let's talk about the Kursk salient and the summer of 1943, because this is where the white camouflage story intersects with one of the greatest tank battles in history in a way that is often overlooked. By the summer of 1943, Soviet armored forces had gone through another complete cycle. The winter camouflage had been applied through the cold months. The spring thaw, the Rasputitsa, had turned the ground to mud and rendered winter camouflage counterproductive. Summer schemes had been applied, or the vehicles had returned to their base dark green, and then as the massive forces for the Battle of Kursk were assembled, the question of camouflage took on a different but equally critical dimension. Kursk was not a winter battle, but the lessons that had been learned in winter fighting, the fundamental insight that visual concealment was a life-or-death issue, had permanently changed how Soviet armored forces thought about camouflage in all seasons. The units preparing for Kursk applied extensive summer camouflage using local vegetation, netting, and natural materials. The logistical effort to conceal the enormous Soviet buildup behind the Kursk salient from German aerial reconnaissance was one of the largest concealment operations of the entire war, and it drew directly on techniques and organizational approaches that had been developed through 2 years of winter camouflage improvisation. The tankers who whitewashed their turrets in the winter of 1941 were the same tankers, or the successors of those tankers, who built the concealed positions and camouflaged assembly areas at Kursk in 1943. The knowledge transferred. The institutional learning happened. And this is one of the ways in which the winter camouflage story is not a footnote to the larger history of Soviet armored warfare. It is a thread that runs through it. Let us also spend some time with the weapon systems themselves, because understanding what Soviet tankers were fighting with shapes the context for why camouflage mattered so much. The T-34, which was the backbone of Soviet armored power through most of the war, was a genuinely revolutionary tank when it appeared. Its sloped armor was ahead of anything the Germans had in 1941. Its 76mm gun was effective against all German armor in service at the start of Barbarossa. Its wide tracks gave it superior mobility in snow and mud compared to German designs, and its diesel engine, while temperamental in extreme cold, was significantly less likely to catch fire than the gasoline engines used in most German tanks. But the T-34 had serious problems in the early war period that are often underemphasized. Its optics were poor. The commander's observation capability was limited. The internal layout made crew communication difficult. In the original two-man turret design, the commander was also operating as the gunner, which degraded both functions simultaneously. And the radio equipment was unreliable and in short supply, with many T-34s in 1941 having no radio at all, relying on flag signals from the lead vehicle. These limitations meant that Soviet tank units were often tactically outclassed by smaller numbers of German tanks in the early war, not because the vehicles were necessarily inferior in raw performance, but because the German crews could see better, communicate better, and coordinate better at the small unit level. A German Panzer III, with a dedicated commander in a proper cupola, using a radio to coordinate with other vehicles, could outfight a T-34 crew that was blind to what was happening around them and unable to communicate with adjacent tanks. In this context, camouflage became even more critical for Soviet survival. If you cannot outfight them in a fair engagement because you are blind and they can see, the answer is not to have a fair engagement. The answer is to not be seen, to shoot first from concealment, to use terrain and camouflage to compensate for the tactical communication deficiencies that the vehicle and doctrine imposed. Whitewashing the turret was not separate from this tactical reality. It was part of the same survival logic. Use what you have, compensate for what you lack. Win not through technological superiority or doctrinal elegance, but through adaptation, determination, and the willingness to do what is necessary even when everything else is going wrong. The KV-1 and KV-2, the heavy Soviet tanks that appeared in the early war period, present an interesting variation on the camouflage story. These vehicles were in many ways even more imposing than the T-34, with heavier armor that made them difficult to destroy frontally, even with the best German anti-tank weapons available in 1941. There are documented cases of single KV-1s holding up entire German columns for hours, absorbing multiple hits that would have destroyed any other tank. But the KV series had problems too. It was mechanically unreliable, it was slow, it consumed enormous quantities of fuel, and its tactical employment was often badly handled in the chaos of the early war. But in winter conditions, the KV's heavy armor became even more of an asset, because it could absorb hits that would destroy a T-34, and the reduced mobility was less of a disadvantage when operating from hull-down defensive positions where the tank was not expected to move quickly. The whitewashing of KV tanks is documented through this period, and the contrast between the enormous vehicles painted white and their massive, heavy outlines even partially concealed in winter snow is one of the more striking visual images of the early war. A KV-1 in full winter whitewash, dug into a defensive position with snow banked against its hull, was genuinely difficult to identify even from relatively short distances. The combination of size, which could make a distant object seem larger than a tank, and the white camouflage breaking up the outline, confused German observers and gunners repeatedly. One thing that is worth addressing directly, because it comes up often in discussions of this subject, is the question of whether the whitewash actually worked in a measurable tactical sense. This is not merely a theoretical question. There are specific documented engagements where the outcome was directly influenced by the effectiveness or failure of winter camouflage. The Finnish-Soviet War of 1939 to 1940, the Winter War, which preceded the Great Conflict with Germany, provided the Soviet military with painful lessons about winter warfare that were partially, imperfectly, and tragically applied to the later conflict. One of the clearest lessons from Finland was that Soviet armor operating in snow without white camouflage was catastrophically vulnerable to Finnish infantry equipped with anti-tank weapons. Finnish soldiers armed with Molotov cocktails, satchel charges, and captured anti-tank guns destroyed Soviet tanks in enormous numbers, and a significant factor in many engagements was the ability of Finnish defenders to spot the dark Soviet vehicles against white snow from concealed positions, plan ambushes, and engage effectively before the Soviet crews could identify the threat. After the Winter War, the Soviet military undertook an extensive review of its failures, and winter camouflage for armor was specifically identified as a deficiency that needed to be corrected. Regulations were revised, training materials were updated, there was genuine institutional effort to incorporate the lesson. But then Barbarossa hit, before those institutional changes had been fully absorbed, and the cycle of improvisation began all over again. There is a specific incident from the winter of 1941 near Moscow that has been documented in several accounts of the period. A Soviet tank brigade, operating in support of the counteroffensive that began in December 1941 and would eventually push the Germans back from the approaches to Moscow, included T-34 tanks that had been whitewashed by their crews before the operation. Operating in fog and falling snow, these vehicles approached German defensive positions and were not identified as tanks by the defending infantry until they were within close engagement range. The element of surprise, directly enabled by the camouflage, contributed to the success of the assault. Several German anti-tank guns that had excellent fields of fire were overrun before they could engage effectively. This is the kind of tactical outcome that the whitewash was designed to produce. Not invisibility, not perfect concealment. Just enough ambiguity, enough visual confusion, enough reduced detection range to shift the engagement in the attacker's favor. In tank combat, getting the first shot off effectively is enormously valuable. If the camouflage buys you even 30 seconds of additional approach time before the enemy gunner identifies you and starts his ranging process, that can be the difference between a successful engagement and a destroyed tank. Let us move to the logistical story in more detail, because it is genuinely interesting and because it explains much of the variation we see in photographic and documentary records. The Soviet defense industry's performance during the Second World War is one of the great stories of industrial mobilization in history. After the catastrophic losses of 1941, including the capture or destruction of enormous industrial capacity in the Western Soviet Union, Stalin ordered the physical relocation of entire factories eastward, beyond the Ural Mountains, into Siberia and Central Asia. This was a logistical feat of staggering proportions. Machine tools were dismantled, loaded onto trains, and moved thousands of kilometers in the dead of winter, then reassembled and put back into production in unheated factory buildings, with workers sometimes living in the facilities because there was nowhere else to go. The result was that Soviet industrial output, which had temporarily collapsed in late 1941, began recovering through 1942, and by 1943 was exceeding pre-war levels in many critical categories. Tank production in particular was remarkable. The Ural Tank Factory at Nizhny Tagil, the Chelyabinsk tractor plant, which acquired the nickname Tankograd, Tank City, and other facilities, were producing T-34s in enormous quantities by 1943, with simplified construction techniques that allowed faster production even at some cost to individual vehicle quality. But paint, and specifically white paint for winter camouflage, was never a priority production item. The supply of military specification paint in general was managed through the central supply system, and white paint specifically was a relatively small item in a system that was managing the distribution of millions of tons of war materiel. Units in the field that were not receiving white paint through official channels were expected, and in many cases officially encouraged, to find local solutions. The official Soviet military regulations on winter camouflage, as they evolved through the war, actually acknowledged this reality explicitly. Lime whitewash prepared from locally available materials was formally recognized as an acceptable temporary winter camouflage solution. The regulations described the preparation method, the application technique, and the expected durability. This was not a case of the official system ignoring the improvisation. It was a case of the official system looking at what was working at the unit level and writing it into doctrine. This is actually quite sophisticated institutional behavior, and it reflects something important about the Soviet military's evolution during the war. The Red Army of 1943 and 1944 was a fundamentally different organization from the Red Army of 1941, not just in equipment and numbers, but in doctrine, in institutional learning, and in the relationship between official policy and field practice. The whitewash example is a small but illustrative case of how field innovation moved upward into doctrine rather than downward from doctrine into field practice. There is also the question of aircraft recognition and what the white winter camouflage meant for aerial identification, both of Soviet aircraft identifying friendly ground forces and of German aircraft targeting Soviet armor. From the air, a white tank against white snow is obviously difficult to spot. This cuts both ways. Soviet ground attack aircraft, particularly the famous Ilyushin Il-2 Shturmovik, which was designed specifically to attack enemy ground forces, needed to identify Soviet armor to avoid attacking it. The Shturmovik was extremely effective against German armor and other ground targets, but its high-angle attack profiles and the difficulty of target identification from low altitude in winter conditions meant that friendly fire incidents were a real concern. Various methods were developed to help Soviet aircraft identify friendly armor. Signal flares were used, vehicle identification panels, sometimes brightly colored cloth panels placed on the top of the tank, were employed. Specific route markings in snow helped pilots know they were over friendly territory. But the white camouflage created a genuine identification challenge that Soviet aviation had to manage throughout the winter fighting periods. From the German side, Luftwaffe ground attack aircraft and reconnaissance planes faced the reverse problem. White Soviet tanks in white terrain were much harder to spot than the same vehicles in summer. German aerial reconnaissance, which had been extremely effective in the summer of 1941 at identifying Soviet troop concentrations and armor formations, became significantly less reliable in winter conditions when camouflage was applied. This reduced the German ability to mass anti-armor resources against identified threats and contributed to cases where Soviet armored concentrations achieved surprise at the operational level. The story of Soviet winter camouflage also intersects in interesting ways with the broader history of how both sides tried to understand each other through captured equipment, prisoner interrogation, and intelligence analysis. German intelligence had a fairly detailed understanding of Soviet tank designs by mid-war. Captured T-34s were studied extensively. The tank was actually test-evaluated at the German Armor School at Kummersdorf, and its qualities were well understood. But the tactical and operational practices of Soviet armored units, including their camouflage habits, were harder to characterize precisely because they varied so much. German intelligence reports from the Eastern Front contain numerous references to the difficulty of identifying Soviet armor in winter, and several explicitly note the effectiveness of white camouflage applied to turrets specifically. These reports were used to adjust German artillery and anti-tank doctrine, including recommendations about the ranges at which fire should be opened against suspected Soviet positions, and the need to use wider search patterns when scanning for concealed armor. The Soviets, for their part, were learning about German winter camouflage practices through similar channels, and there are cases where Soviet tactics were adjusted specifically to defeat German concealment methods. The relationship between offense and defense in camouflage, between the effort to conceal and the effort to detect, was dynamic and evolving throughout the war. Now let us talk about the specific tanks and how the camouflage was applied to different designs, because the details matter, and they varied considerably. The T-34 in its original 1940 and 1941 configuration had a cast turret with a distinctive rounded shape that was actually relatively easy to whitewash because it had few complex geometric features. The main challenge was the gun mantlet and the area around the main gun, where grease and oil contamination from the gun mechanism could prevent whitewash from adhering properly. Experienced crews learned to clean these areas before applying whitewash, and to accept that they would need reapplication more frequently than other surfaces. The later T-34-85, which appeared in significant numbers from 1944 onward, had a larger, more capable turret housing the 85mm gun. This turret was also the target of whitewash application, and the increased size actually made it somewhat easier to cover thoroughly. The broader turret ring and larger commander's cupola created more surface area, but it was surface area that was generally accessible from the engine deck. The photographs of T-34/85 tanks in winter conditions from 1944 to 1945 often show more thorough and more even whitewash coverage than the earlier T-34 variants, reflecting both the improved supply situation and the accumulated experience of crews who had by this point been managing winter camouflage for multiple years. The IS-2 heavy tank, which entered service in 1944 and became one of the most powerful and feared armored vehicles of the entire war, presented a different camouflage challenge. Its massive, rounded turret housing the 122mm gun was a prominent visual target, and whitewashing it was both practically important and physically demanding. The turret of the IS-2 was significantly larger than the T-34s, and reaching the uppermost surfaces required improvised approaches, sometimes involving another crew member lifting a third to apply material to the top of the turret. But the IS-2's role also influenced how thoroughly the camouflage was applied. These heavy tanks were often used in direct fire support of infantry assaults on fortified positions, a role that did not always reward subtle concealment as much as raw firepower. The IS-2 was not primarily a stealthy weapon. It was a battering ram. However, even in this role, The approach to a firing position could be made significantly safer by reducing the vehicle's visual signature, and IS-2 crews in winter did whitewash their turrets, even if the overall camouflage philosophy was somewhat different from the concealment-oriented approach of the T-34 units. The KV series, by the middle of the war, was being phased out in favor of the IS series, but during the period when KVs were in active service, their camouflage practices were consistent with the general pattern. The enormous bulk of the KV made complete camouflage difficult, but the whitewash turret against a snow background remained the standard approach. Light tanks like the T-60 and T-70, which were used extensively in the early and middle war period, despite being increasingly vulnerable to German anti-tank weapons, had smaller turrets that were actually relatively easy to whitewash completely. These vehicles, which operated in reconnaissance and infantry support roles where concealment was particularly important, often showed some of the more thorough and consistent whitewash coverage in period photographs. The Lend-Lease tanks provided by Britain and the United States also appeared on the Eastern Front in winter camouflage, and their experience with Soviet-applied whitewash is an interesting footnote to the larger story. British Valentine and Matilda tanks, and American M3 Lee and Sherman tanks all received Soviet-applied winter camouflage when they were used in winter conditions. The application methods were the same: lime, whitewash, and improvised approaches, but the underlying paint colors and surface textures of these vehicles were different from Soviet designs, which sometimes affected how well the whitewash adhered. There are documented complaints from Soviet tank crews about the difficulties of applying whitewash to the American Sherman, whose large, curved surfaces and somewhat different metal finishing created challenges for lime whitewash adhesion. Soviet mechanics and maintenance personnel developed slightly modified preparation methods for these vehicles, typically involving a more dilute initial application to improve adhesion before the main coat was applied. This is a minor detail, but it illustrates the level of practical problem-solving that was going on at the unit level throughout the war. Let us also discuss the human experience of winter cam.